It was not just a test, it was a trap, cold and calculated, designed by a man who had forgotten how to trust. Inside the grand marble mansion of Richard Hale, silence ruled like a ghost. The crystal chandelier above cast shards of light across the floor, where a massive steel safe stood wide open. Inside it, stacks of $100 bills, ropes of gold, and glittering diamonds shimmered like bait, waiting for a desperate soul. Richard stood hidden behind the tall oak doorway, his heart a fortress of suspicion. For years, betrayal had been his closest companion, a wife who walked away with his fortune, a business partner who forged his name, a friend who sold his secrets. Wealth had made him powerful, but it had also made him paranoid. And now he wanted proof. Proof that honesty still existed in a world where loyalty was bought and love had a price tag. That proof had a name. Grace Thompson. Grace was his housemaid, 32, a widow, a woman who carried silence like a second skin. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, hair tied back, eyes tired yet focused, moving through the mansion as if trying not to disturb the ghosts that lived there. Richard had studied her for weeks, her routine, her steps, her every habit. He knew at exactly 8:42 a.m. She would enter the study to dust the shelves. He had ordered the security cameras off, dismissed the guards, and left the safe open just for her. Now he waited. The ticking clock grew louder, echoing like a countdown, when the door creaked and a shadow appeared in the light. Richard's pulse quickened. Grace had arrived, and in the next few minutes, he would learn whether the last piece of his faith would live or die. Her name was Grace Thompson, and her story began long before she stepped foot into Richard Hale's mansion. At 32, she had already buried a husband, faced eviction twice, and watched her mother's body weaken under the cruel rhythm of chemotherapy. Yet every morning, Grace still rose before dawn, moving through her tiny apartment like a soldier preparing for battle. The sound of her alarm at 4:45 a.m. was followed by the soft hum of a kettle, the quiet laughter of two little girls, and the rustle of school uniforms being folded neatly on the couch. Lily, 7, loved to hum while brushing her hair. Sophie, 5, preferred to cling to her mother's skirt and ask endless questions about the stars, about heaven, about whether Daddy could see them. Grace never had an answer, but she always smiled and said, "He's proud of us." When the sun broke the horizon, she would kiss their foreheads, leave a note for their grandmother, Margaret, and head out into the morning mist. Margaret was a fighter too, but cancer had stolen her strength. Some days she could barely lift a spoon, yet she always insisted on watching over the girls while Grace worked. "You keep that job, sweetheart," she'd whisper, gripping her daughter's hand. "We don't need pity. We need pride." The drive to the Hale estate was long and silent. The closer Grace got, the more she felt the weight of its grandeur. The mansion stood like a monument to power, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. Inside, everything gleamed, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, walls lined with art worth more than her entire life's savings. Grace had been working there for 7 months and 12 days, long enough for the staff to notice her rhythm. She was the kind of worker who spoke only when necessary, whose movements were so quiet you could forget she was in the room. Yet nothing escaped her attention. Dust never lingered. Silver never lost its shine. And the master of the house, Richard Hale, had begun to notice her silence more than he'd ever noticed noise. To most people, silence is absence, but Grace's silence carried weight. It was not fear, it was discipline. She had learned that words were dangerous, that gossip could end jobs, that pity could turn into poison. So she worked, head down, back straight, mind focused. Every sweep of the cloth, every polished surface was a small prayer for stability, a plea for one more day without disaster. Her coworkers whispered stories about her in the break room. She never complains. She never takes a day off. She doesn't even check her phone. But none of them knew that Grace's phone was broken. She couldn't afford a new one. And even if she could, she wouldn't waste time scrolling through lives that looked easier than hers. What she wanted wasn't luxury. It was safety. A roof that wouldn't leak. Medicine for her mother. Shoes that didn't pinch her daughter's toes. Dreams that simple can still break a person when they're too far away. Every paycheck was divided before it even reached her hands. Rent, medicine, food, school. There was never enough. But she never borrowed, never begged, never took shortcuts. Grace believed in earning, even if it meant exhaustion. That belief was the reason she still had her job. The previous housekeeper had been fired for stealing jewelry from Mrs. Hale's old collection. Richard's trust in people had already been thin. When Grace arrived, he told her nothing about the past, but he watched her every move. And now, after 7 months of observing, he was ready to push her to the edge. He wanted to know whether her calm was genuine or merely a mask worn by another thief waiting for a chance. At 8:42 tomorrow morning, she would walk into that study, unaware that her honesty was about to be tested in the cruelest way. Before Richard Hale became the man who hid behind marble walls, he was someone who believed too easily. He once thought loyalty was something money could never corrupt. He thought love was forever. He thought friendship was sacred. Life taught him how wrong he was. The first betrayal came from the person he loved most. Elaine, his wife of 12 years, had shared his dreams, his table, and his fortune. Together they built Hale Industries, a business empire that turned him into a millionaire before he turned 40. He believed every word she said, signed every paper she placed in front of him, and never questioned her late-night meetings or secretive phone calls. Then, one morning, he woke up to an empty bed and a letter on the dresser. Elaine was gone, along with their lawyer and a large portion of his wealth. She had used his own trust as the weapon that destroyed him. The divorce that followed was ruthless. Every courtroom session stripped another piece of him. When it was over, he walked away with his company intact, but his heart hollowed out. He swore to himself that he would never be that blind again. But pain has a way of disguising itself as pride. He told himself he was strong, yet every decision after that came from fear. He stopped letting people in. He stopped listening. He started building not just an empire of business, but an empire of isolation. Then came the assistant, the one he trusted to rebuild what his ex-wife had broken. A man named Paul Denton, sharp suit, sharper smile. Paul played the part of a loyal confidant so perfectly that Richard began to believe maybe he had finally found someone honest. But within 2 years, Paul had siphoned hundreds of thousands from company accounts, laundering money under fake contracts. When the fraud was discovered, Paul vanished overseas before the police could reach him. That betrayal cut deeper than the divorce. Elaine had broken his heart. Paul had broken his faith in people. By the time Richard reached 50, he lived like a man behind invisible bars. He had bodyguards but no friends, lawyers but no laughter, staff but no warmth. His house was immaculate, yet silent. Every wall gleamed, every floor shone, and yet the air was heavy, as if happiness itself had been locked out. He had money, yes, enough to buy anything except the one thing he wanted most, peace. That was when Grace Thompson entered his world. She didn't arrive like a storm. She arrived like a whisper. A quiet woman in a gray uniform who looked him in the eye without fear, without flattery, without the calculating smile he had learned to spot from a mile away. At first, he thought it was an act. Everyone wanted something, a raise, a favor, a connection. But Grace wanted nothing. She worked, she cleaned, she left. She was polite but distant, respectful but never submissive. Her background check came back spotless. No debts, no criminal record, no suspicious ties. It was almost unsettling. People like her didn't exist in Richard's world anymore. He began to feel something unfamiliar curiosity mixed with suspicion. He found himself studying her gestures, her tone, the way she refused to take leftovers from the kitchen even when offered. She never lingered, never gossiped, never slipped. It irritated him at first, then it unnerved him. He had spent years learning that everyone had a price. But what if this woman didn't? What if beneath her quiet eyes was not deceit but truth? That thought terrified him more than any betrayal ever had. Because if Grace was real, then maybe he had been wrong about the world. And if he had been wrong, he would have to face the man he had become. So he decided to test her, to push her, to prove that even the purest hearts could be tempted when gold glittered in front of them. It was not cruelty that guided him that night. It was fear wearing the mask of control. Tomorrow, he would set the trap. Wednesday began like any other day. But for Richard Hale, it was the morning he would finally test the truth. The air inside the mansion was unnervingly still, thick with the kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. The marble floor gleamed under the golden light of dawn, and the heavy steel safe in his study stood wide open, its contents deliberately exposed. Bundles of crisp bills, gold chains, and diamond necklaces caught the light, scattering tiny sparks across the room. Richard had planned everything down to the minute. The cameras in the hallway were turned off. The staff were told to take an early break. No one would pass by that corridor. Only one person was scheduled to enter the study that morning, Grace Thompson. He stood behind the tall oak door, hidden in shadow, hands pressed against the wood as if steadying himself. His heartbeat was loud enough to echo in his own ears. For years he had trusted locks, alarms, and contracts. Today, he was trusting instinct. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with merciless precision. 8:40. 8:41. The sound grew louder, like footsteps marching toward a verdict. He checked his watch once more. The second hand trembled as it moved. Any moment now. A faint sound of soft-soled shoes came from the hallway. Her steps were light but certain, the rhythm of someone who had done this every morning for months. The click of the door handle broke the silence, and a sliver of sunlight spilled across the carpet. Grace stepped in. Richard held his breath. She was dressed in her usual gray uniform, hair tied neatly in a bun, her face calm but tired. She carried her dusting rag and cleaning kit, unaware that the world around her had shifted. For a moment, she didn't notice the open safe. She hummed quietly to herself, setting her supplies on the corner table. The sound of fabric brushing against wood filled the air. Then it happened. The sunlight hit the polished metal of the safe door, reflecting a bright flash across the room. Grace froze. The hum stopped mid-note. Her eyes shifted toward the gleam, and her body stiffened. Richard felt the tension like a current running through the floor. Every muscle in his body locked. This was the moment. Grace took a slow step forward. Her gaze moved from the desk to the open vault. Inside, the stacks of cash looked almost unreal, like props in a cruel play. The bills were arranged neatly, the jewels sparkling like silent witnesses. Her breathing changed, slow, controlled, uncertain. She glanced toward the hallway, her eyes darting to the corners as if searching for someone. There was no one there. Richard leaned forward slightly, eyes unblinking. Grace hesitated at the edge of the vault. Her gloved hand trembled just slightly, enough to betray the storm inside. She reached out, not toward the money, but toward the edge of the door, fingertips brushing the cold metal. Richard's pulse roared. This was it. Would she take it? Would she look around? Would she fold like all the others had before her? Grace lingered there for what felt like eternity. Then she exhaled softly, lowered her hand, and stepped closer, not with greed, but with purpose. She pulled out her cleaning cloth and began to wipe the safe's surface with the same quiet care she gave to every other object in the house. Slow, gentle, precise. Her movements were graceful, almost reverent. Richard stared, stunned, as the tension in his chest turned to confusion. He had prepared for betrayal, not for serenity. The dust cloth moved in steady circles, the gold reflected against her face, yet she never looked at it directly. She was not tempted. She was tidying chaos without knowing that chaos was testing her. When she straightened up, the light caught her eyes, and for a fleeting second, Richard thought he saw something in them, something he had forgotten existed. Integrity. The clock struck 8:43. The test had begun, and he was already losing. Grace froze before the open vault. Her breath caught halfway between fear and disbelief. The air felt heavier now, like the walls themselves were waiting to see what she would do. Her reflection glimmered faintly on the polished steel of the safe door. Two versions of herself staring back. The woman she was, and the one she could become if she took what wasn't hers. For a moment, temptation whispered. The sight of all that money, more than she would ever earn in a lifetime, was enough to make anyone's knees weak. Her mother's hospital bills flashed before her eyes. The letter from the landlord demanding rent, the shoes that didn't fit her daughters anymore. Every problem she carried seemed to have an answer sitting right there, in neat green stacks of paper. Her gloved hand lifted slightly, trembling, hovering over the cash. Richard Hale, hidden behind the door, could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. His eyes locked on that hand, waiting for it to close. One movement. That was all it would take to confirm what he already believed about the world. But then... Grace inhaled deeply and pulled her hand back. Her gaze softened. The storm in her chest quieting. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, creased from years of wear. She opened it carefully, her hands shaking not from greed, but from the weight of what it held. It was a small photograph, faded at the corners. In it, two little girls smiled brightly beside a frail woman in a hospital bed. Lily and Sophie, Margaret, her whole world captured in one fragile memory. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. She just looked at the photo for a long moment, the chaos of the world around her shrinking until only their faces remain. Behind the door, Richard felt a strange ache in his chest. He had expected guilt, deceit, excuses. What he saw instead was love, quiet, unspoken, defiant love. Grace pressed her lips gently to the picture. "We'll be all right," she whispered, barely audible, but the words carried a power that filled the room. She folded the photograph carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. Then she turned back to the safe. Her movements were deliberate, calm, almost reverent. She took her dusting cloth and began to wipe the edge of the door, brushing away invisible specks of dust. Every gesture was precise, delicate, as if she were handling something sacred. The money didn't interest her. The jewels didn't even exist in her eyes. All she saw was her reflection and the promise she had made to her daughters to live honestly, no matter how hard life became. When she finished, she stepped back, checked that nothing was out of place, and slowly closed the heavy door. The metallic click echoed through the room like a final verdict. Richard exhaled sharply, realizing he had been holding his breath the entire time. His hands trembled. He leaned against the wall, stunned by what he had just witnessed. Grace stood there for another second, her fingers brushing over the cool surface of the safe, almost as if to seal her own conscience inside it. Then she turned away, picked up her cleaning supplies, and continued her work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had happened. Behind the door, Richard felt the ground shifted beneath everything he believed. He had set a trap for deceit and found devotion instead. He had expected weakness and uncovered strength. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't name. It was small, quiet, but unmistakable. Hope. Richard Hale stood frozen behind the door long after Grace had left the study. The silence she left behind was deafening. The air still shimmered faintly where the safe had stood open, but the real weight in the room now rested on him. His hands trembled against the wall. He could still hear the faint echo of her whisper, "We'll be all right." He had expected greed, guilt, maybe even fear. What he saw instead had broken something inside him. Grace had closed the vault, but in doing so, she had opened his heart. For the first time in years, Richard felt tears rise behind his eyes. He blinked hard, but they came anyway, hot and uninvited. One slipped down his cheek, and he hated that it did. A man like him wasn't supposed to cry. He had built an empire on control, yet one woman with a cleaning cloth and a tattered photograph had undone him more completely than any loss he had suffered. He stumbled back into his chair, the weight of his own life pressing down. Every betrayal he had ever endured returned in flashes. Elaine's cold eyes across the courtroom, Paul Denton's fake smile before disappearing with his money, the empty champagne toasts from friends who had only ever stayed close for profit. He had turned all that pain into armor, convincing himself that trust was weakness. But Grace had shattered that illusion, not with words, not with apologies, with silence, with an act so small, it felt infinite. She had chosen honesty when no one was watching, dignity when temptation was inches away. Richard ran a hand over his face, trying to steady his breath. His reflection stared back from the dark glass of the window. For the first time, he didn't recognize the man looking at him. He saw loneliness wearing a suit. He saw suspicion dressed as strength. He saw a man who had forgotten how to believe in goodness. He stood, pacing the length of the room, the floor creaking beneath his steps. The memory of Grace bending over the safe replayed again and again in his mind. The way she held that photograph, the quiet resolve in her eyes, the tenderness in the way she closed the vault, as if sealing away his doubts. Each replay dug deeper into his chest. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was something closer to shame. He had tested purity, and purity had passed, but he had failed. He walked to the desk and sat down, staring at the blank notepad in front of him. The pen felt heavy in his fingers. Words wouldn't come. For a long moment, he just sat there, listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each second sounded like a heartbeat reminding him that he was still alive. When night fell, the mansion changed. The lights dimmed, the corridors turned hollow, and the house felt larger than ever. Richard sat in his study, surrounded by the things he once believed mattered. The leather-bound books, the antique clock, the safe behind him now locked tight. Yet all he could see was the look in Grace's eyes as she whispered to her daughters through that picture. Hours passed. He tried reading. He tried pouring himself a drink. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her standing there, humble yet unbreakable. The image struck him harder than any betrayal. By midnight, he gave up trying to fight it. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, eyes wet, voice breaking as he whispered into the empty room. I was wrong. For years, he had built walls so high that no one could climb them, but Grace hadn't tried to climb. She had simply stood at the base of them and reminded him that kindness still existed. The night stretched long and sleepless, and somewhere between the ticking clock and the darkness, Richard Hale felt the first crack form in the fortress around his heart. It wasn't pain. It wasn't regret. It was something far rarer. It was awakening. The morning sun crept through the kitchen window, painting soft lines across the countertop where a single white envelope waited. It looked ordinary, almost invisible against the polished marble. But to Grace Thompson, that envelope would change everything. She arrived, as always, before sunrise. The mansion was still asleep, wrapped in silence and shadows. Grace hung her coat on the hook, tied her apron, and moved toward the kitchen to begin the day's work. The faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, though no one had brewed it yet. Then she saw it, an envelope, perfectly placed in the center of the counter, her name written in elegant, heavy strokes. Grace. Nothing else, no logo, no address. Just her name. She hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. The paper was thick, expensive, and the handwriting unmistakable. Richard Hale. For a second, her heart stopped. Did she do something wrong? Did he discover the safe test? Was this her dismissal? Her breath quickened, her mind spinning through every possible mistake she could have made. But when she opened the envelope, her eyes froze on the words inside. Integrity is priceless. You have given me peace again. Use the enclosed for your mother and daughters. It is not a reward. It is a thank you. The handwriting was steady, firm, but the ink had bled slightly in places, as if written by someone who had paused too long between sentences. Inside the envelope was a check, blank but signed. The name Richard Hale bold at the bottom. It shimmered faintly under the morning light, as if alive. Grace's knees gave out. She dropped into the nearest chair, the letter trembling in her hands. Her eyes moved over the words again and again, as though reading them might make them real. You have given me peace again. Tears filled her eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to contain the sob that escaped anyway. For so long, she had carried her burdens quietly, never asking, never hoping. Now, out of nowhere, kindness had found her. Not charity, not pity, but gratitude. She unfolded the letter once more, her tears staining the edge of the page. Her reflection wavered on the polished countertop, and for the first time in years, she saw something she had almost forgotten hope. In her mind, she saw her mother, Margaret, lying in that hospital bed, her frail hand gripping hers. She saw Lily and Sophie, barefoot on the kitchen floor of their tiny apartment, giggling as they colored on scraps of paper. The weight that had sat on her chest for years began to lift, piece by piece, like fog dissolving under the sun. Across the mansion, in his study, Richard Hale stood by the window, watching the garden bathe in light. He didn't need to see her reaction. He already knew. Last night, he had sealed the letter with a shaking hand, his pen hovering for a long time before signing his name. When he wrote those words, it had not been from guilt, but from awakening. Grace wiped her tears, folded the note carefully, and pressed it to her heart. The morning light caught the edge of the paper, turning it golden. She whispered softly, "Thank you," though no one was there to hear it. Her sobs came again, this time gentle like rain against glass. She wasn't crying out of sadness anymore. She was crying because the world had proven her wrong in the best possible way. In that kitchen, surrounded by silence and light, Grace understood something she had almost forgotten. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. Sometimes they come quietly, in an envelope with your name written on it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that makes even the smallest house look like home. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with maple trees beginning to turn amber. A modest car rolled to a stop in front of a small brick apartment complex. The driver's hands gripped the steering wheel for a moment, as if steadying himself before facing something bigger than business. Richard Hale had come to see Grace Thompson. He stepped out of the car holding a leather folder and a bouquet of white lilies. The air smelled of rain and soap and something humble. As he climbed the narrow staircase, the sound of laughter floated from one of the upper windows' light, pure and unguarded. For a man used to silence, it was disarming. Grace opened the door before he could knock. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. She looked different outside the mansion. No uniform, no gloves. Just a simple blue blouse and tired eyes that softened when she saw him. "Mr. Gay Hale," she whispered, unsure whether to smile. "Richard," he corrected quietly. "Please, just Richard." Behind her, the apartment was small but clean, filled with sunlight and the scent of home-cooked soup. On the floor, two little girls, Lily and Sophie, were building towers from colored blocks. They looked up at the stranger in the doorway, curious but not afraid. "Girls," Grace said softly, "this is the man who helped Mommy." Lily stood, clutching a block in her tiny hand. "Are you the one who made Mommy cry happy tears?" Richard blinked, caught off guard. Then, A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Maybe I am. Within minutes, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by laughter and chaos. Sophie climbed into his lap to show him her crooked tower. Grace stood by the counter, watching, disbelief turning slowly into warmth. The image was so surreal it made her chest ache. After a while, Richard reached for the folder he had brought. Grace, he began, his voice quieter now. I didn't come here to thank you. You already know how much your honesty meant. I came to give you something better. He opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. The official letterhead glimmered faintly. This is a contract for a house, he explained. A small one, in a better neighborhood, closer to your mother's clinic. Everything is taken care of, no debts, no tricks, just safety. Grace stared at the papers, unable to move. Richard, I can't accept this. You can, he interrupted softly. And you should, because it's not charity. It's acknowledgement. She swallowed hard, her eyes filling again. Why me? He looked at her for a long moment, the lines in his face deepening. Because you reminded me that good people still exist. Because you showed me that integrity doesn't die just because the world forgets it. The words hung between them, heavy and real. Grace nodded slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. Before leaving, Richard paused at the doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame. The late afternoon light streamed in behind him, warm and golden, wrapping his silhouette in a soft glow that made him look almost timeless. He turned back toward the small living room where two young girls sat together on the couch, their eyes wide with wonder after the day's unexpected events. He looked at them for a long moment, his expression gentler than they had ever seen. Your mother, he said quietly, is the bravest person I've ever met. You should be proud of her. The older girl nodded, her voice small but steady. We already are. Something inside Richard shifted at those words. The simplicity of her response carried more truth than any speech he had ever heard. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The city stretched before him, bathed in the soft colors of the setting sun. The air felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath. He walked slowly toward his car, but stopped before opening the door. For the first time in years, he did not feel like an employer or a wealthy man surrounded by privilege. He did not feel haunted by the ghosts of his mistakes. Standing there, watching the sunlight fade into dusk, he felt something far rarer. He felt human again. The mansion was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, light seemed to reach every corner. Richard Hale stood in his study, looking at the closed safe. It was no longer a symbol of fear or control. It was a reminder of the woman who had taught him something he had spent a lifetime forgetting. He used to believe power came from protection, from walls and locks and contracts. But now he understood that real strength was quieter. It was found in the small moments no one ever sees, in the decision to walk away from temptation, in the courage to be honest when no one will ever know. He thought of Grace, of her trembling hands as she touched the safe, not to take, but to clean. Of the photograph she carried like a prayer. Of the two little girls who had no idea their mother had changed a man's entire world. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in deep gold. Richard whispered into the still air. Maybe she was right. Maybe peace was never lost. Maybe I just stopped looking for it. Far away, in a small apartment filled with laughter and warmth, Grace tucked her daughters into bed. Lily's small voice broke the quiet. Mommy, are we rich now? Grace smiled softly, brushing the girl's hair from her face. We're rich in the things that matter, she said. Because sometimes the greatest tests do not come with witnesses. They come in silence when no one is watching. When the only person who will ever know the truth is the one in the mirror. And in that truth lies the real treasure. Not gold, not diamonds, not a bank account full of zeros, but a heart that stays clean when no one is there to see it. If this story touched your heart,